EU4 is a game where people's main aims are usually to conquer the world through mainly military means. An underrated way to play EU4 though is expanding through personal unions, and therefore through diplomatic means instead. Austria is a key example of this, gaining potentially the big European powers of Burgundy, Bohemia, Milan and Hungary under a personal union. To take these countries through military means would be a long and painful process, whereas getting these countries through personal unions is quick and a much easier process with limited rebellions and devastation. I personally believe diplomacy is significantly underrated in the game, and most people prefer to focus on both admin and military power. Today though, we're going to do this mechanic of diplomacy justice and discuss whether it's historically accurate around the time of the 15th century. Obviously, Paradox needs to standardise this mechanic, or it would be far too complicated to the average player. The landscape of diplomacy, with the Renaissance and the discovery of a new world, changed the dynamics of European politics around the time of EU4. People at the time wouldn't be able to fathom the evolution of diplomacy, since it's vastly different to what it was back then, with embassies and the United Nations. Also, we're trying to get to 100,000 subscribers by the end of the month, so we can go on the Ulm trip. So why not click that button? So without further ado, let's get into the video. Let's first discuss the state of diplomacy within EU4, and it's a system that has quite a lot of different aspects to it. Talking about the very basics, the standardised relationship between a country is 200 and -200. The relationship you have with a country decreases through declaring war, being rivals, sending insults, having a different religion, events and decisions. To increase relations though, you can also send a diplomat to any nation in the world, and your relations increase over time up to 100, unless you have some sort of improved relations advisor. Quite realistically in the game, other nations judge you based on several factors. If you have a weak army and navy relative to the EU4 nation you're trying to ally, then it's going to be more difficult to gain an alliance, since you provide low value if they are attacked or want to start a war. The attitude nations have towards you is also dependent on whether they desire your territory, or you have common enemies and rivals that you both wish to take down. As the game has developed, diplomacy in EU4 has also become better over time, and the new favour system is a great addition to the mechanic of diplomacy, allowing you to gain ducats and asking other nations to prepare for war, so they are more likely to join your cause. Compared to most other strategy games in fact, this is probably one of the most complicated and fleshed out aspects to a game. In terms of diplomacy, Total War or Civilization 6 have a far more basic diplomacy system that is nowhere near as dynamic. I do think the complicatedness of these sort of aspects within the game is one of the reasons why people enjoy Paradox games within the strategy market. However, that's not to say it can't be more complicated and added to in far more depth, so that people are able to enjoy the game more, and this brings us onto our next section. Looking at diplomacy in historical reality, international relations around the start date of EU4 are going through a transition phase. Before the start date of EU4, medieval diplomacy was the main tool of international relations. There were no permanent embassies within any medieval states, and in order to communicate with one another, the leader of a realm would send nobles and lords to be an ambassador for the kingdom and make demands of other kingdoms within the area. In Catholic Europe as well, the church was commonly used in negotiating peace treaties, since it was in the church's interest to stop warfare between Christians. Bishops and archbishops were the best suited, but in extreme cases the Pope might get involved. It's important to understand just how powerful the Pope was, and he could veto certain agreements between two other major European kingdoms. This is something that couldn't be imagined today, but during these centuries, religion was of supreme importance, and the Church was the most important institution, therefore giving the Pope maybe too much power. Alliances also tended to be signed through dynastic marriages. We can see this when Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou, and a peace treaty between France and England was signed. Leading up to the mid-15th century, however, with the Renaissance occurring at the start of the game, we also appear to have an innovation of internal relations, which is known as Renaissance diplomacy. This form of diplomacy developed among numerous Italian states, particularly in northern Italy, where all the states were fragmented and highly competitive with one another. During this period, the power of the Catholic Church began to gradually decline, and powers within Europe had limited control over northern Italy. With the lack of a hegemonic power, and a strong interest in Italian states cooperating and solving problems through peaceful means, these city-states developed their own form of diplomacy to effectively deal with internal affairs. Since there were multiple powers, and they had to hire mercenaries to fight their wars, which was costly and far outweighed the potential gain of a war, you can see why they went this route, and city-states could not rely on their military power. Many of these Italian states also had a commercial drive, and had a different motivation to the feudal northern European lords. Just after the start date of EU4, the first permanent diplomatic mission was established in 1450, representing the Duke of Milan to Cosimo di Medici in Florence. The main task of resident ambassadors was to gather information and develop relations. In a world without newspapers, they became crucial intelligence gatherers. Diplomatic reporting was the key tool for communication between diplomatic missions, and ambassadors were busy writing these reports. I suppose we could say this has a bit of representation when a diplomat builds up his spy network and gains intelligence on an EU4 nation. Renaissance diplomats also enjoyed diplomatic privileges and immunities. The person, premises, and communications of diplomats were protected by diplomatic immunity. This, of course, is something we still use today, and I guess it's good that you aren't afraid that you may be executed if you say the wrong thing. The golden age of Renaissance diplomacy began in 1454 with the Treaty of Lodi. This was significant because it brought Milan and Naples into a definitive peace alliance with Florence. The treaty provided a new state system model and institutionalised a regional balance of power built on diplomacy. There's even a Milanese EU4 event referencing this treaty and gives you either manpower or improved relations with Naples, Venice and Tuscany. Going beyond the start date of EU4, however, the evolution of diplomacy is rampant, with the start of a Reformation as well, that happens not too long after the start date in EU4. The Pope begins to lose his power over the European leaders, which yet again changes the power dynamic within Europe. Over the 400 years that this game occurs, I would say that it's impossible for the game to completely be historically accurate when it comes to diplomacy, because it changes so much over time. So given what we know about diplomacy historically, does EU4 represent it in a good way? Overall, I'd say that it actually does, and needs to be standardised, so players don't find it too complicated. It's therefore nice to see the level of depth Paradox have gone into, so you can have interesting interactions with other countries. One thing I would say though, is that it would be nice if the diplomats had some character traits, and maybe a diplomatic rank that would give them certain benefits. For example, if a diplomat was fluent in English and is working for the French, he could improve relations to a greater extent with England. What do you guys think though? Are there any adjustments you'd make in order to have diplomacy better represented? Let me know in the comments. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye for now. Shout out to our Patreons: J Erickson 321, Shadow Singer, Jado52, Kargon, Flyerton, Henriki, Redguard 76, Xiaomi, and Charlie Demerel. Your support means a lot, guys.